Like and subscribe, join the Discord, the Minecraft server, the Patreon, follow the Instagram. Now let's dive. Whoever shot into the crowd on that fateful day of October the 1st of 2017, firing over 1,100 rounds into the crowd is truly terrible. But based on all the available evidence, it was very clearly not Stephen Paddock. My only goal today here is to prove that, just like the many witnesses stated that night, there was not merely one man in the Mandalay Bay firing, but countless others, and also that basically everything the mainstream media has told us about that night is an outright lie. And there's a lot of ways to prove this. One could go through the over 600 police reports that were made, proving there were multiple shooters, but that would be boring and way too long. So let's try it my way. First though, I want it to be known that my prayers are with the victims and their families, and I sincerely ask, just like last episode, that God holds them near to him and his son for all time, and helps us shed some light on what really happened that evening. That being said, let's decimate the prevailing narrative around that day. On October the 1st of 2017, there were shootings reported across the entire Vegas Strip. Over 1,100 911 calls were made that evening reporting shooters in hotels, casinos, cars, helicopters, and much more. The first issue is, however, that unless you know where to look for these, you're not going to find the archives of them. Meaning the average person is just going to take the police narrative at face value. And that's where this really begins, with the police narrative. My goal here is not to blame individual officers, as I believe there were many brave first responders that evening who deserve far more credit than they ever received. I do, however, also understand that there are a number of corrupt officers amongst that cohort who carried out orders that would typically get you fired. And really the only way to address such a problem is to go to the source. So let's start with Clark County Las Vegas Sheriff Joe Lombardo, who is the definition of a fraud, and will be referenced back to many times this evening. On that evening of October the 1st and throughout the coming days, he would lie consistently about what happened and change the timeline of events, not one, not two, but at least 3 separate times. And the first major red flag is that prior to the shooting ceasing across Vegas, he had already reported that Stephen Paddock had taken his own life somewhere between 10:14 and 10:16 p.m. So let's take that fact, run with it, and see where it leads us. Let's give the benefit of the doubt and consent that Stephen is dead by 10:15 p.m., which I don't believe, but like I said, the benefit of the doubt. Then how do you explain the over 600 phone calls that came into police reporting shooters at the Bellagio, Mirage, Tropicana, Planet Hollywood, Hooters, and much more? Just take a listen here for yourselves.
Monday, October 2, 2017, 0:21 and 33 seconds.
911 emergency, Zagorski 15953. Do you need police, fire, or medical?
My friend who's a security guard at the Harris just texted me, said there's a shooter in the Harris too, and they don't know where he's at. The one ran through there, and they haven't caught him. So I don't know if that's something you guys know, but he just texted me. He's a security guard at Harris, and his exact words were, shooter at Harris. He said, we got a shooter in our hotel. I said, are you okay? He said, yeah. I said, did you catch him? He said, no. I said, where is he? He said, we don't know. He ran through our Sorry. But yeah, that's basically what he said, and that was just now.
I have hundreds of these I could show you too, and most of the shooting reports happened after Lombardo had notified us that Stephen had passed away. Indeed, I can find records of shootings being reported as early in the morning as 1 and 2 a.m., 4+ hours after Stephen had supposedly taken his own life. And since that's undeniably true, unless you want to be the guy to tell over 600 people that they were wrong about what they witnessed, then Sheriff Lombardo is clearly a fraud, and lied about the outcome of that night's events. But why would he do that? What does he stand to gain? Well, much it seems, because his career's been on quite the up and up since then. But before we discuss where Lombardo is today in his career, we might as well discuss what he became known for as the sheriff of the Las Vegas Metro Police Department. And boy, I must say I hope he sees this. It is on good evidence that Lombardo is allegedly involved in a multi-decade-long real estate scam where he uses embezzled public funds to purchase millions of dollars worth of real estate, including several mansions, which he then gives to members of his family to hold where they cannot be taken. It's also worth noting he was sheriff during several suspicious deaths in prison. Violent crime also spiked 67% in a single year under his new police program meant to stop it, and he's been fined by Nevada legal teams for a host of things, including election fraud. And he was so worried about the tapes, recordings, police reports, and autopsy files from the Vegas shooting that we'll be looking at later, that he battled for them to be hidden from the public, taking it all the way up to the Supreme Court of Nevada. We actually won, though, and had a decent amount of information released to us, enough to prove that beyond a doubt there were multiple shooters. But it would be more if Lombardo had not ordered all of his men to sign NDAs and to speak to no one about what happened that night. And even worse is that he put out a gag order to shut off body cams to everyone but one guy who went into Paddock's room. However, despite all these obvious offenses, it seems to have worked out for Sheriff Lombardo, because now, can't make this up, you should call him Governor Lombardo because he's the governor of Nevada, which is a disgusting thing to think about. especially considering that he's practically the entire reason that people still believe today that Stephen Paddock was a lone wolf shooter. For the aforementioned reasons and others, the available footage from that night is very slim. We only have a handful of phone videos from the first few minutes of the shooting, as well as some police body cams we'll look at later. But in this phone footage, we can see clearly that despite hundreds of rounds raining down into the crowd, none of them seem to be leaving from Paddock's room. And shortly after the shots began, police began arriving, and those on site enter the crowd to help victims and take down the shooter. But it is worth noting that based on these recordings, it sounds like these bullets are coming from different places at different speeds. Which would explain why at this time almost every police report discusses believing multiple shooters were present and that the shooters were staged both in the crowd and surrounding it. I will link the reports below, but from my reading, none of the officers believed that the shots were coming from the Mandalay Bay until they were later notified of that possibility. And we can't 100% confirm where the rumor that the shooter was in the Mandalay Bay began, but we can clearly tell that the people on the ground didn't agree with that theory, and the officers themselves don't seem to either as they continue searching the crowds for threats as people run past them. Moreover, at this instance, if we're assuming that the report came from dispatch, I'm not sure how they got the idea that Stephen was in the Mandalay Bay because the police officers weren't saying that and neither were the crowds. So it just doesn't really make sense to me. However, the notion that this shooter was in the Mandalay Bay also runs counter to what the crowd was actually warned about that night. And I guarantee you that unless you are super deep into this case and have done a lot of research on the shooting, you probably haven't heard that there was a Mexican woman and man who fought to the front of the crowd and began screaming something to the effect of, "We are surrounded by them and everyone is going to die." And this warning came 45 minutes prior to the first gunshots being launched. Security then escorted this woman and man out, and no one has heard from them since. And I couldn't find any video on the matter either, which makes sense considering the FBI confiscated photos and videos from that night and deleted recordings and messages, allegedly, although they don't want to admit that. However, we do have one little known interview from a young lady who tells a reporter about the incident from her perspective, and it's really chilling.
We went back up to the room, and as soon as we reached the room from the concert venue, we just heard constant shootings. At first we thought it was fireworks, but then it was shooting.
And then somebody said something to you to tell me about that experience.
Yeah, so there was a lady who pushed her way forward into the concert venue into the first row, and she started messing with another lady and told us that we were all gonna die tonight.
Do you know why she was saying that? I mean, was this after the shots were fired, or?
It was about 45 minutes before the shots were actually fired.
You might agree this seems like the sort of thing that one would investigate. After all, a woman did just predict the worst mass shooting in American history, but in her message to the crowd is something key. She states that they were surrounded, meaning that many men were lying in wait. But there's no way that these men could have gotten away with this after all, right? Surely someone would have said something or seen something. And indeed, from various reports I've encountered, it does seem like people did reference this matter.
Everyone started to get up to run. They just kept shooting, and it's like literally like 5 minutes of just shooting, and people just kept dropping. And it was definitely someone on the ground. Definitely, most definitely. The way they heard it, the crowd, and all of us, and then they kept coming. They even came into the back staff parking lot and shot people out there too. So they just kept coming, and I hope they get them.
All right, this is crazy. I don't know. It seems like it's coming from up there. Oh,
And if we assume that some of these men were shooting as is believed, then we have to also think that that would explain some of the trajectories that don't make sense if Stephen Paddock was the only shooter. Because if you were to look at the autopsy reports, you would notice that many of these bullets enter and exit parallel to the ground, which isn't possible from the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay. Especially considering that the windows weren't broken in Stephen Paddock's room, but shh, that's for later. What I think would then be a more logical assumption is that if there was an elevated shooter, which I'm not even going to argue because some of the bullet trajectories do make that argument, then there are other places besides the Mandalay Bay that would make sense. Indeed, I think it's incumbent upon us, if we're going to suggest an alternate theory for that evening, that we at least give a possible location the shooter could have been. Now, I didn't know this until recently, but the Route 91 Harvest Festival shares a venue location with an abandoned motel on the exact same grounds. It's called the White Sands Motel, and it offers excellent vantage points of everything, including the stage where, as discussed in the last video, Jason Aldean's bass guitarist Instrument takes a rather impossible shot if Stephen is the only shooter. That being said, I know I teased you guys, so for more evidence that Stephen Paddock is an impossibility as the shooter, let's go look at the aforementioned body cam footage. And in this footage, we can make some shocking discoveries. When watching the original body cam footage of this officer's chin, we notice something funky. Firstly, we notice that there are only 1 or 2 members of the SWAT team that are actually SWAT team members, which makes me wonder what the rest of the SWAT team was doing that night, but my bad, I'm getting distracted. Before we get into my commentary though, I would like you to just review the footage yourself and see if you notice anything odd about the room.
What do you need, Levi? Sir! Hear him. We do not have a broken window. No, there's several rooms in here for you. You remember, one window, right to the right for you. Right where that curtain is, right past the door. Okay, stand by. We've got curtains open on a window that's not broken. It's us. Corey, it's us. We have to go ahead. I'm up here.
I'm sorry, what was that? One more time for us at home for posterity's sake?
We do not have a broken window. Okay, stand by. We've got curtains open on a window that's not broken. It's us.
Oh, okay, so that's cool. We know Stephen, or whomever is lying on the floor here, definitely wasn't the shooter then, based on the authorities' own words, because the windows weren't even broken, according to the people who would have had the most intimate knowledge of what that room looked like when they entered. And I do find it odd that right after this revelation, what I imagine is a higher-ranking officer begins yelling at this Corey fellow who was just speaking about the unbroken windows, and is clearly telling him to be quiet, saying either it's done, or it's not, or it's over, something like that. You can't quite make it out, but it's certainly the "shut up, dude, stop talking right now, we are on camera" tone.
It's us. Corey, it's us.
And poor Corey, who's just trying to do the right thing and make the report of no broken windows to dispatch, gets yelled at twice, both times he tries to do it. He then goes on to spend the rest of the little footage we have sounding a bit frightened and then leaving the room for the hallway a few moments later. I do suppose this is why Joe Lombardo told his men to turn off those body cameras before they entered.
My camera's on too. Yeah, turn them off. Turn them off. Yeah, my camera's on too.
Boy, would I like to know where Officer Corey is today. He seems like the only man in there, and most certainly the only man in there willing to tell the truth. Also, the fact that Officer Corey clearly reports that the windows are not broken will help give us an understanding as to why an old man several floors beneath Paddock's room later reported hearing an explosion and glass falling to the ground. Here's that call for you now.
Sunday, October 1, 2017, 23:32 and 13 seconds.
911 emergency, Brown 15968. Do you need police, fire, or medical? Hello?
Oh, just got a question here. So I just checked into Mandalay Bay, and I'm on the 21st floor, and I'm not sure if I should be trying to leave the hotel or stay in my hotel.
No, please do not. Do not go anywhere, okay? Please stay there and do not go anywhere. It is not safe for you.
Okay, and I just heard what sounded like a explosion above me, and then glass coming down around me, or right outside the window. So I don't know have you guys heard anything about explosions?
Yes, it's the whole strip right now, okay? So I need you to just stay put, okay?
And I want to note that this call came in at 23:32 and 13 seconds, or round about 10 minutes after the SWAT team entered Paddock's room, and several minutes after the body cam footage goes dark. And these explosions would explain why on the body cam footage, we know that the windows weren't broken, but later on, we know by the next day, these windows were certainly broken because the media published the photos everywhere. And I guess this is really a wonderful example of why I'm happy to pay for body cams. It's unfortunate that the rest weren't turned on because of the corrupt police sheriff, but I digress on that point. And I imagine it's also why Sheriff Lombardo also had the not-so-SWAT team wait so long to enter Paddock's room. In fact, most aren't aware that the not-so-SWAT team took a whopping 72 minutes to enter into Stephen Paddock's room, which makes me wonder how Lombardo knows then and can be so confident that Paddock had died at 10:15 p.m., roughly, when we know his men didn't get there until roughly 11:30 p.m. For all we know, Stephen could have watched nearly half of the best Star Wars film film Revenge of the Sith for those at home, while sitting there in his complete luxury suite waiting for police. Or, used any of the other 5,000 rounds of ammunition he had ready to go, sitting on his floor to pick off the officers that would have been completely in his view trying to breach the building. And something else a little funny I noticed about this footage is that when it's used by the mainstream media, they completely leave out the parts where the not-so-SWAT team talks about the window not being broken, further convincing me that we are certainly onto something. But the window isn't the only thing that is revealed to us in the body cam footage and police reports of entering the alleged shooting floor. As you may have noticed, the not-so-SWAT team waits for the breaching charge to go off before entering Steven's room. This was because, according to all accounts, Steven had bolted the door shut, making a keycard unusable. But, once again, the LMVPD disproves themselves, this time in their crime scene photos. In said photos, you have one image which shows Paddock's door with the bolt still activated, which would be expected if the cops had to force their way in, as stated. However, the same door in a different photo shows the bolt deactivated, so either the cops staged the scene, disrupted the crime scene, lied, or Stephen Paddock wasn't holed up in there as we had been told. Also worth noting is that on this same footage of SWAT entering, we can hear the fire alarm begin going off when the SWAT team blows in. But this fire alarm doesn't go off when the shooter was supposedly firing over 1,000 rounds from the exact same room. That doesn't seem very likely now, does it? It also would have been a huge boon for the authorities when trying to identify the shooter's room, which was originally reported as being a difficulty for the police, if they could have just gone, oh, there's a fire alarm going off on the floor we think there's a shooter at. Maybe we should go there first. But it doesn't stop there with the doctored evidence, as the police will incriminate themselves once again. Third time's a charm, I suppose. This is Stephen Paddock's second room. Stephen Paddock had been comped to this giant suite by MGM because he was their star money launderer. Review episode 1 for that information. This other room, which is seldom mentioned by the media though, was also Stephen's. It, however, wasn't actually under his name, to our knowledge. It was listed under the name of Mary Lou Danley, which is Stephen's girlfriend, baby mama. And this room was comped using her points with the Mandalay Bay. With that out of the way, going back to the footage, when the police breach in, then we realize that the not-so-SWAT team didn't think that they should solidify their story before telling us, as they stated that they had to blow through this door as well to get in. The cited reason being that it was locked from the other side. While gee whiz, on my scout's honor, I would have wagered that this was the same room Stephen Paddock was allegedly running into to fire onto the crowd from, as well as his main room. But how he could do that, if the other room was locked from the opposite side to the point SWAT had to use an explosive charge on it, is a little confuzzling. But I mean, we are dealing with professionals here. However, in case you needed a confidence boost in our not-so-SWAT team, the response is further fishy because this room 134 wasn't known to be connected to Stephen yet because it was listed under his baby mama's name, as she's the one who was getting it comped for him with her points, which makes me find it doubtful that the police knew immediately that this was Stephen's room because it wouldn't have shown up on Stephen's reservation as his name. I could be wrong about that. I don't know, but that's just the logical assumption I'm making. But giving them the benefit of the doubt, let's just assume they knew it was Stephen's room. I suppose you could assume it's empty, but you don't know that because Stephen Paddock had been hooking with a hooker while staying at MGM's Mandalay Bay, according to their records and police records. So for all we know, she's in there terrified while the police are blowing in. Keeping all this in mind, the lack of regular procedure, professionalism, or even decorum displayed by this team is beyond imagination. And even if you somehow, I don't know how you could, but even if you do somehow still believe the mainstream media narrative, you do have to admit that this is the most unprofessional SWAT team breach you've ever seen. And even more so because this is the same not-so-SWAT team that had 3 negligent discharges in a row just mere moments earlier. I know, a real tip-top cracked team we've got here. But hey, despite their flaws, at least they know how to relax after a tough day's work of being 72 minutes late to a shooting by robbing Stephen's mini fridge like a Reddit mod salivating over Pringles. That's not hyperbole either.
Want some Pringles? One suspect down at Trop, it sounds like.
What's also interesting about these 2 doors that the not-so-SWAT team had to blow through is that according to hotel records, they were opened multiple times throughout Stephen's stay simultaneously, meaning that unless Stephen is Miss Incredible or Stretch Armstrong, someone else had to have been in his room. At least one other someone. In fact, these someone or someones had to have been with Stephen in the room the day of the shooting because we also have reports of the doors being opened simultaneously that day as well. And what's interesting is, despite what the feds might tell you, we actually have an idea of at least who one of these suspects could have been. And it's this strange Aussie fellow named Brian Hodge, who, as is thematic in this tale, retells his story multiple different ways depending on who's asking. And he does more no-nos than I can count. And more specifically, Brian Hodges accidentally lets loose a higher and more exact number of guns that were in Stephen Paddock's room than the police had up to that point, and refers to them as machine guns. He also tells the Aussie newscast that Stephen had arrived on the 28th of September when he had in reality arrived on the 25th, which is a really weird thing to suggest you know when you didn't even arrive at the hotel yourself until the day before the shooting, so he couldn't have known when Stephen arrived anyway. Additionally, Hodge tells us that the other employee in the hallway along with Jesus Campos had been shot and killed in the incident, which would make sense considering the 200 rounds that were said to have been shot through the door of Stephen Paddock's room. Hodge also intentionally altered his GPS on his phone so that his Twitter couldn't monitor him. This does seem like an odd detail, but it was to lie on Twitter where he was that night for clout. He had said that he was hiding in the bushes outside the Mandalay Bay, which the police would later come out and say straight up was a lie. Brian would then go on to tell several other lies about his location that day, but we won't get into all of those. All this being said, one would anticipate that your level of self-incrimination couldn't rise higher, but if we were on Mount Everest, we haven't even reached the halfway point yet. Hodge's most prominent example is that he tells the news agencies that Stephen had utilized a hammer to break the hurricane-proof windows of his hotel room to get a good vantage point for his shooting, which he couldn't have known because it hadn't been released yet. And he also then states that he had been staying in the room right next door to Paddock's room, that being 134, which is the adjoining room that had actually been comped to Stephen Paddock's baby mama that he had allegedly been shooting from that very night, but clearly couldn't have been for the other reasons. So now he's claiming to be staying in the shooter's room. Something is very, very wrong here. To the point you would anticipate that Brian was number one on the police's suspect list, or at least that Brian was taken in for questioning, as he basically admits to being an accomplice. But in fact, no. When the FBI began to investigate him, high-ranking feds went, nah, we're not going to do that, and prevented anyone from interrogating him or searching him for more information. But it doesn't stop there. Brian isn't the only suspicious person we know that was with Stephen in the days prior to his death. Indeed, there are 3 unknown women, unknown to us I should say, whose names have been redacted from reports who were also registered to Stephen's suite, but were never investigated. And none of these women were Stephen's baby mama, who as stated was in the Philippines tasked by Stephen with the purchasing of a home. And none of these women were the hooker, as far as I can tell. So who were they then, right? I sure would like to know as well, but according to the authorities, they essentially don't really exist. And Lombardo never even bothers to mention them, and I'm fairly certain that they aren't even in the final report on the matter. Don't quote me there, though. But we do know that since they were registered on Stephen's room with the hotel, they could have been there at any time, including during the shooting, or when Stephen, what's the friendliest way to put this, repainted the ceilings. And on that note, I do plan to save the interior crime scene for a future installment of this series because most of the issues we will discuss don't pertain to the multiple shooters theory. However, there is something important to note, that being that in this room we can see the handgun that Stephen allegedly used upon himself. And I'll try not to be too morbid here, but I do need you to bear with me for 1 second. According to the police autopsy report for the body that allegedly belongs to Stephen Paddock, as well as several photos of where the body ends up, Stephen is standing facing the windows with his revolver against his teeth in the roof of his mouth, when he then proceeds to pull the trigger. One would expect the gun to land in front of him after flying from his hand, or maybe off to the sideways and something in between those 2 options, as it basically always goes. The one place though it shouldn't end up is behind him, and yet that's where it does end up, several feet behind Stephen. Which isn't how math works, but what also isn't how math works is that after Stephen allegedly takes his own life around 10:15 p.m., he then teleports across Las Vegas shooting rounds at people who weren't even at the music festival.
That's a shot. That's a shot.
What was that? Oh, right here. Go.
And then leaves various calibers of bullet casings miles away from each other, including one instance where a bullet casing is found by the police in the Paris Hotel bathroom at 3:49 a.m.
Thanks, guys. Here. Want a glove? Yeah, it's a gold dot spear, yeah. I'm fairly confident that's ours. I don't think he was using 223.
That's the purpose. Make sure you check anybody who's available.
For the sake of avoiding comments asking, these body cams are in UTC time, which is why the time is different than what you might expect. On top of that, several witnesses find loaded magazines discarded in different locations on the Vegas Strip, and, get this, multiple guns laying in the street and by other hotels and casinos, with one man even picking up said firearm he found near the valet and handing it to the cops.
3820, and also just so you know, what we had got before the shots fired, we did have a guest who brought a gun to officers out near valet, so it was a gun found also near the valet entrance.
Near the valet entrance, excellent.
This obviously is ridiculous. Steven didn't teleport anywhere, though at this point that is what you'd have to believe in order to account for the over 600 separate calls that are going to come in about shootings, as we mentioned, in addition to hundreds of other calls about dead bodies and strange discoveries, all of which happened after Steven's alleged demise. We listened to some of these civilians earlier, but here is a really critical one for us to hear and to sear into our minds.
We were staying in the bar area, in the base of the bottom of Delano, the casino level of the Delano, and I saw two gunmen with looked like AR-15 type rifles come around the corner of the hallway, and they positioned themselves in a tactical manner with their rifles pointing down the hallway. At that point, I moved away from the hallway so I wouldn't be shot at or shot, and then as soon as I moved, shots were fired, multiple rounds, probably 5 to 10 rounds at a minimum, and then moved to ran to the elevator and took the elevator up.
Now that's a bit stranger than many of the rest that I encountered. Clearly there were multiple shooters present. Once again, your other option is teleporting dead Stephen Paddock, but also it's clear that these other shooters weren't just angry 64-year-old gamblers who sold arms in the nighttime. No, these men were, based on this man's description, serious, highly trained killers there on a mission. I told you at the beginning of this video that I will save the theorizing for another episode, which we will get into, but we do have a pretty good knowledge for this instance that the powerhouse members of the House of Saud were present that day, including the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and there is a video which appears to show said prince being escorted by armed guards from the Hotel Tropicana. I don't know if I believe that's him or not, but it is interesting. It does look a lot like him. And this is the same Tropicana hotel and casino where dozens of calls would later come in about multiple active shooters. And the Saudis being there also coincides with a civil war among elite members of the House of Saud that had been taking place during this time, including one family member named Al-Walid bin Talal al-Sud, who at the time was among the top 20 wealthiest men on earth and had actively been involved in funding ISIS, and who had hated his younger cousin Mohammed bin Salman because he was focused on removing some of the old Saudi customs, and because Al-Meid was originally supposed to be the next ruler of Saudi Arabia. That is a lot of family tea we don't need to get into right here, but this guy who funded ISIS was then imprisoned for months after the Vegas incident in the Four Seasons Hotel in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where the Crown Prince was holding a bunch of people, and the price for Al-Weed's escape was a staggering $10 billion in full loyalty to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, which he did eventually accept, paying the full ransom, and was fortunate to even get such an option, as many of his supporters would end up with the Khashoggi treatment. And it's worth noting that right here, the ISIS connection becomes very prominent because ISIS, whom Unk was a major funder of, would then go on to take credit for this shooting incident, not one, not two, but at least 3 separate times. The same ISIS, which, despite what some people might try and tell you, is known for only taking credit for those things which they are involved in. Which is also interesting considering that one report from an eyewitness discusses seeing shooters in the Tropicana, and the man does actually manage to get a good look at them, good enough to describe their height, weight, build, and outfits. The man who phones in these shooters, though, was just one of dozens who would confirm his report of what he had seen. However, the Tropicana conveniently would later come out and deny any shooting had ever happened or occurred on their property, despite it obviously having happened. And it just makes me wonder where the security cameras are for all of this. After all, Vegas makes China look like a free-for-all with no big brother. Indeed, in that clip of what is allegedly Mohammed bin Salman being escorted from the Tropicana, we can see at least a dozen cameras in a 30 square foot radius, which only speaks to how many are covering Vegas and the Strip as a whole, constantly filming everyone and everything. And not a single ounce of this footage has been released. I find that hard to believe, unless something else is going on. For instance, the fact that MGM basically owns this entire area, and the police were, based on what we can tell, allegedly likely in on it, meaning that everything is sealed up tighter than insert questionable joke that gets me in trouble. Not to mention the FBI, based on available evidence, went around threatening people afterwards into silence and not allowing the most likely criminals to be investigated, like Brian Hodge. So far, we've listened to a bunch of audio and seen a host of footage that proves beyond a doubt multiple shooters were present. However, believe it or not, I have yet to drop the most incriminating bit of evidence. In fact, we haven't even spoken of the helicopters yet, which are arguably the most important aspect of this entire investigation. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and sound schizo for a moment. I dare say even more so than I might already, but bear with me. The night of the shooting, we know many passed on, and God please rest their souls, but the only verifiable shots we can see on any body cam footage or cell phone cameras I've encountered are coming from the sky. Now, I don't doubt Stephen Paddock's ability to teleport around Las Vegas, shooting up and planting evidence in various casinos, but I do have to draw the line somewhere. And where I draw said line is the idea that Stephen Paddock could have flown in the air and hovered while firing hundreds of rounds from a distance into the fleeing masses. That just doesn't make any sense to me, but it's what you'd have to believe in order to maintain the sole shooter narrative. Because in between the two Mandalay buildings, not too far from where the shots were reported to have come from, we do see what are, by all appearances, muzzle flashes bouncing in and out at irregular intervals. There are no buildings that tall in between those two hotels, and there are no helicopters meant to be there. We do, however, know they are there, as we shall discuss shortly. And assuming that these are helicopters, we can be confident that they are not the anti-collision or identification lights because they are bouncing in and out at too irregular of a pattern, as noted. Therefore, we are really left with muzzle flashes as the next most likely option based on the setting, and if I were to assume, likely those from heavier weaponry. The sort of firearms which would be capable of shooting long distances, although I wager they weren't aiming at the crowds, at least not initially. However, based on the toll, it cannot be denied that the shooters on the ground were aiming for the crowd, and these helicopters would also explain the shots that many perceived were emanating from Mandalay Bay. Like we said, the angle and height is not that much different from where Stephen Paddock was allegedly stated to have been. And these helicopters, considering the cost, are a sign of a very, very well-funded terrorist organization, or the government. Tell me if you can spot the difference there. Continuing on the notion of government involvement though, we do get some serious proof of major manipulation when we begin reviewing the flight radar data from that evening. Firstly, I want to point out that the time code below says October 2nd, because once again, just like we looked at with the body cam footage, flight radar data is also done in UTC. So it may say October 2nd, but it is the exact time of the shooting. And on the flight radar map, we are going to notice some incredibly interesting things. I could explain it myself, but there is a professional who I believe does much better justice for the information.
We're going to notice a number of things in this data that just seems weird. There's a number of anomalies that we should pay attention to because I think they give a bigger picture of what may have happened. Here we see one helicopter leaving Maverick Helicopters, a second helicopter getting ready to leave, and you can see their call signs, their tail numbers. That third one turned its transponder on a little bit late. So those three helicopters depart at about 9:40 p.m. from Maverick Helicopters, which is right here. And you'll notice that they're going to come back around from the north. And they're going to stop directly behind the Mandalay Bay. So this first one hovers right there, right over Mandalay Bay, right over the event center, kind of oval-shaped roof. Here comes the third and the fourth. Notice that first helicopter, what happened is it turned off its transponder. These other two are about to do the same, and they turn off their transponders as well. And they remain there, no transponder signals come back on for the duration of the shooting. So they turned off their transponders at about 9:52, and no more transponders will appear in that area. But what's interesting is that even though we have no radar data showing flights in that area, video evidence clearly shows flights being in that area during the shooting.
I think the video speaks for itself. There are, however, a few other instances where helicopters do come into play, like the one we can see land on the roof of the Mandalay Bay. This roof actually brings a lot into question because it's the top of the Mandalay Bay, yes, but what you might not know, and I didn't until researching, is that it's actually on top of the Ritz-Carlton, which is the hotel that occupies the top floors of the Mandalay Bay building. And that Ritz-Carlton is owned by the cousin of Mohammed bin Salman, the guy who funds the CIA, ISIS, which is another reason I do find it highly likely that at least a part of this whole incident was a Saudi family war occurring in our desert instead of theirs. And then after taking off the helicopter, we presume it's the same one, flies at a low enough altitude that it can pass over a group of people who are fleeing, and by sheer fortune, we actually get a really weird clip that proves this helicopter was super low, either looking for someone or picking someone else up, because on this footage we can see the wind, which is really closely to like a hurricane wind on the camera, but since there's no hurricane, we know it's a helicopter right above said camera. We then catch what I presume to be the same helicopter flying away on this other handheld camera footage. Even stranger, when these helicopters eventually do land, but for a brief second, it's not from where they originally took off, and the business is called Sundance Helicopters, which would later close down, I believe, in 2020. The sheer amount of buffoonery here that these helicopters are involved in is baffling. And if you're curious, check out the full video in the links below, where he goes through the entire, I think it's 20 plus minutes, which is several hours of transponder footage, and it just gets crazy. But for our purposes, on the night of the shooting, the helicopter office was also very active. Not just the choppers themselves, as once again, a number of calls were made from there detailing more shooters. And one of these calls came from the boyfriend of the front desk lady there, who had told him there were multiple armed suspects shooting people, as well as a bunch of other people hiding in the hangars and in the building, and yes, likely several injured and possibly at least one deceased individual.
Sunday, October 1, 2017. 22:43 and 48 seconds.
911 emergency, Rodriguez 15978. Do you need police, fire, or medical?
I'm sorry. It's there's an active shooter at Sundance Helicopters.
Okay. Did you see the shooter?
I'm not there. My girlfriend works there. She's a supervisor. She texted me and said there's a shooter.
Yes, we're aware of that. Okay. Where's your girlfriend now?
To my knowledge, she's still there, but I was trying to get through to just like...
Yeah, we have thousands of calls.
But Steven's on the floor of his hotel room over a mile away. That's weird. That would be a mighty impressive shot through his unbroken windows, through the hangar walls, and into the people he couldn't see, which are probably almost a mile away at this point, hours after he'd supposedly entered into the judgment room. And we do get confirmation via video of these people, or at least who we assume are these people, who are later reported at the helicopter hangars, because there is an aerial video from, I presume, once again, a police helicopter watching a group run across the runway. The airport also noticed these people, and somehow airport administration came to the conclusion that it would be best to turn off the lights, so I guess they could hide them and make it easier for these people not to be seen. I don't know, but also suspicious. All these factors included as well, the level of control and power one must have had is unprecedented in order to be able to turn on and off transponders flying in this airspace, shoot and then land and leave without being hunted down, run across the airstrip of a major airport, and even have airport admins turn off the lights for you is insane. Telling this story is like telling the story of one giant, enormous manhunt times assassination attempt multiplied by war. It makes no sense to my mind. However, that's all we can assume was happening at this time, as a hunt of some kind was clearly happening across the city of Las Vegas, as calls continued coming in for many hours after Steven's death, and even after these people are reported at the helicopter pad. And these are some of the strangest reports you're going to hear. And it seems an additional battle takes place because, I kid you not, 9, count it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 separate police body cams are going to pick up automatic gunfire in and around the Bellagio, another MGM property that supposedly has tunnels connecting the two. Just keep that in mind.
We are not...
Bellagio, PDR, about a shot being fired. Units, we're getting a 415A now, Bellagio, PDR, is hearing about a shot being fired.
Yeah. When they breached, they said one SWAT shot him.
We're getting A now, Bellagio, PDR, is hearing about a shot being fired.
That's a shot. That's a shot.
What was that? Oh, right here. Go. Oh, machine gun.
Units, we're getting a 415A now, Bellagio, PDR, is hearing about a shot being fired.
Is that what it was? Oh, right here. Go. Oh, that's machine gun. That's machine gun fire.
Units, we're getting a 415A now, Bellagio, PDR, is hearing about a shot being fired.
And this property also had one of the largest proportions of calls coming in after Steven's alleged demise, denoting that there were more incidences with shooters and bodies dropping and other weird stuff in general. So how then did Stephen Paddock manage to revive himself again and get all the way over to the Bellagio to conduct another shooting? And the obvious answer is he didn't. And once and for all, if anything proves that other men were involved in this shooting, it is the fact that Stephen Paddock was hours dead while automatic gunfire is ringing through the Bellagio and across the Vegas Strip. And that dozens of other shooters were reported across hundreds and hundreds of calls, police documents, and literal video. This story is so massive, it's hard to get a real scope on it, but it's also hard to tell it sequentially because with how much cover-up there is, we don't really know the total sequence of events if we're honest with ourselves. So beyond the obvious, I'm not going to claim to know some master plan of what happened and the timeline of events because if anyone's truly honest with themselves, no one does. But it's also hard because there are so many things that happened that night that are just beyond imagination. But in addition to that, there are just so many extra events that to tell the story would take hours. And so there are these fascinating facts that I wanted to include for you guys that you're not going to be told anywhere else, but I hadn't really a good place for them in the video without completely murking up the story as we know it. So let's just go rapid fire with these very interesting facts. A woman calls the police saying that 20 people are being held hostage in the Brooksy, which is a restaurant, and that someone she knows inside had texted her this information and is no longer responding. The police didn't investigate to my knowledge. And the woman on the call sounds really creepy and way too calm. A shooter's reported at Hooters, and everyone was hiding under tables, scared for their lives. Once again, no public follow-up as far as I'm aware. 2 men were seen outside of the apartments located near the initial shooting incident, and witnesses report that they were trying to hide in the bushes while changing clothes. Once again, no follow-up as far as I'm aware. More times than I said did people find shell casings across the Vegas Strip, and at least 2 separate guns were found by random citizens. A man staying beneath Paddock's room reports hearing a single gunshot go off. This may not sound odd at first, since Paddock fired over 1,000 rounds, allegedly, except this shot rang out at 3:50 p.m., 6 hours and 15 minutes prior to Stephen allegedly beginning his shooting onto the festival. Which could the shooter of this shot have actually been one of the other people tied to Stephen's room, and could this possibly have even been the time when Stephen actually passed away? That's actually Stephen on the floor of the room, which we'll get into in the next episode. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The police reported to CNN, who reported to the public, that the not-so-SWAT team had been engaged in a violent struggle with Paddock, which is too crazy of a thing to pass up, because Stephen was lying on the floor and had been that way for, according to the police, at least 72 minutes, and the SWAT team was most certainly not taking any fire from him.
Right, it's been back and forth on this one. You know, it was initially reported that perhaps he had taken his own life at the very moment the SWAT team was making entry into his room on the 32nd floor. Now they've clarified that point. They say that as the SWAT officers actually broke in the door, that the gunman charged them, made it through the door, struggled with the officers, and was able to get off at least one shot, wounding one SWAT officer in the leg, and then that gunman was killed.
There was interaction. All right, Martin Savage, thank you very much. And you know, when you think about what happened here, it happened over 10 to 15 minutes, which can seem like an eternity or sound like not much time at all for such horrific carnage. At the end, 59 people, as of this moment, have died. 527 more are wounded.
On a video site that collects footage of acts of violence that I won't name here, you can see a man stand up and stare into the distance asking to be shot. Weird, but evidently he survives at least the next few minutes from what I can tell. We touched on this in the autopsy discussion, but on the same site I had the displeasure of watching firsthand footage of the victims, and the number of headshots is unprecedented, and the angles are further impossible coming in from flat from the side, which I also had the unfortunate pleasure of seeing the aftermath of. There was a car reported as having a bomb that same night. The threat was so credible that the bomb squad came to disarm it in the valet, but the reports later tell us it was just a weird electric car. Not really sure what that means, considering it was reported as having been a series of plastic tubes with various colored wires coming out of them. That night, the police Twitter account was giving delayed updates, but even then, still hinted at multiple shooters, saying things like one shooter is confirmed to be down, which implies more than one was active. There's a video where we can see multiple people suspiciously running across a roof in black clothing. No idea who those are. And the chick in charge of mediating the settlement between MGM and the victims actually turns out to be very good at her job. Her name is Jennifer Tagliotti, and she's just good at her job, not for the victims, but for MGM, who ended up only having to pay out $800 million to victims. Probably the only time you'll ever hear me say the word only and $800 million right next to each other. And because this may sound like a lot of money, but most lawyers argue that it should have been something like $7 or $8 billion paid out to victims, so almost 10 times as much money. And on top of this, for MGM, insurance ended up paying out most of the money that they were supposed to pay, meaning I think they were on the hook for something like $50 million. But the real kicker is that the broad in charge of managing the settlement, her dad was the man in charge of security and surveillance for MGM during the time of the shooting. And if that's not a conflict of interests, I don't know what is. But once again, this is just the start. We haven't even gotten to the weirdest of everything that happened the night of that shooting, because in the next episode, we're going to look at the actual crime scene, and that being Stephen Paddock's room. So that being said, I'm gonna take a quick second and just say thank you so so much, you guys, for everything that you're doing for the channel. 53,000 subscribers in a month is insane. 1.7 million views, and you guys seem to be loving the Epstein and Vegas series. So just thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. I also want to say a specific thank you to everyone on the Patreon. Lowest tier to the highest, it goes a huge, huge way. With that in mind, Paul, you know who you are. Paul carries on the channel. He's a huge Patreon donor and it means a lot. So thank you specifically to you. This is my third time recording this outro, but I want to shout out everyone on the Minecraft server, the Discord, which is blowing up, and the Instagram. It means a lot. Thank you guys for all the extra support in all the other places. And finally, I want to take a second and say, I love life. I have no intentions of taking my own life. If I just disappear into the forest, I didn't just disappear. If my brakes stopped working, they didn't just stop working. And all the other things you can think of, I'm in great health, don't keep power cord at home, I know how to swim. If something happens, it wasn't me, and someone else is involved. So investigate. But yeah, it means a lot. Thank you for everything, guys. And I really, really sincerely hope you enjoyed this video. It gives me a lot of joy to know that we might be able to bring some peace and answers to the people who were affected by the shooting. All being said, thank you guys for everything you're doing. And I cannot wait to see each and every one of you in the next one.